Congress was meant to be the beating heart of our democracy, but today it's in danger of flatlining entirely. But what if the real problem is Congress's brain?
It is definitely the case that knowledge is power. You're not going to get competent governance if you have ignorant people.
If our founding fathers could see today's Congress, they would scarcely recognize it. The same institution that they worried might become a vortex of power, bending the rest of government to its will, has in recent years been alarmingly indifferent to confronting even the most obvious of problems through direct legislation. Many members of Congress are seemingly more interested in posturing for their social media followers than in delivering substantive policy wins for their constituents. Numerous solutions have been proposed for this institutional erosion, most of which boil down to either electing better people or doing what we can to change our culture of partisan gamesmanship. But there is a different, simpler way to try to reinvigorate Congress. Make it smarter by increasing its in-house policy expertise. Congress can't make good laws without good information, and for proponents of building legislative capacity, at least some of our seemingly more deep-seated political dysfunction can be linked to Congress's failure to keep pace with the demands of our time.
100 years ago, if you were elected a member of Congress and came to Washington, D.C., you could basically understand the entirety of the federal government. It was maybe 10 departments. Most of the people worked for the U.S. Postal Service. The federal government just kind of focused on a handful of things. Now it's involved in everything. How do you, as an individual elected, pay attention to all that? It's impossible. It's too big. You can't see the whole of the elephant. So the knowledge problem for Congress is immense, and it's not just because we have a whole bunch of dunces up there. It's because policymaking is so complex and the federal government is involved in so many issue areas.
Members of Congress are, by definition, generalists. Their job is to represent the views of as wide a cross-section of their constituents as possible. But in an increasingly specialized world, that broad view often feels more like a weakness than a strength. In response, Congress often enacts vague statutes and leaves it to the executive branch to work out nearly all the details through regulations. In theory, this is nothing new. Some degree of regulation has always been necessary. No legislation, no matter how robust, can cover every single circumstance, and figuring out what a law means in practice is a key part of the executive branch's constitutional duty to execute the law faithfully. What's unusual about the current situation is both the sheer number of regulations and the range of what they cover.
So we've got this body of laws, the U.S. Code, and it sets out a lot of responsibilities for agencies. But then they go and make regulations. And it's, in some ways, the regulations are like the part of the law that actually tells regulated entities how they need to act. So environmental law, consumer protection, banking law, all these things fall under the auspices of regulation. And when we think about what are the main powers of the federal government, taxation, the military, regulation really is a big part of the federal government's authority.
Originating in the progressive era push to make government more professional and efficient, these regulatory agencies, bearing familiar acronyms like FTC, SEC, and EPA, are staffed not by career politicians, but by field matter experts drawn from academia and the private sector. The result is that vast swaths of modern American life, from the emission standards for our cars, to the security at our airports, to the labels on our food, are now governed not by our duly elected members of Congress, but by unelected, unaccountable technocrats. This has certainly streamlined policymaking, but at the cost of undermining faith in our democracy.
Technocracy, or rule by experts, sounds appealing because it sounds like, oh, well, we can take the politics out of decision-making, and won't that be great? But in fact, you end up just hiding the ball a lot of the time. You end up having experts who do have political positions dictating policy while pretending that they're just doing so from the position of neutral expertise. And that really sets up the American people to become very distrustful of expertise and to worry that they're being manipulated. If we write statutes in an open-ended way that leaves us thinking executive branch agency officials can just do whatever they want, we lose the sense that the citizens are really in control of what's going on. And that's where we get a real problem of legitimacy for the actions of the federal government.
Compounding this potential for abuse is the fact that, as the executive branch has grown in power over the last century, its control over the administrative state has become an increasingly valuable weapon in the president's decades-long fight to wrest control of the policymaking process from Congress. Not that anyone should be surprised by that, least of all Congress.
Congress has basically built the presidency into a colossus. The president wouldn't be so powerful if he didn't have 180 agencies through which to exert his will. But those agencies didn't crop up on their own. They're funded by Congress every year. They were created by laws through Congress. And so Congress inadvertently has just built up the presidency into this thing it has a hard time controlling. And trying to put that genie back into the bottle is a very, very tall task. There are those on the right who say, well, we could fix the situation if we just get rid of all those agencies. But getting rid of them is really tough because all of them have constituencies and supporters, voters who like them, interest groups, lobbyists. Cutting government is hard. But you know what's easy? Strengthening Congress. Because we have a complete free hand to build up Congress as a countervailing force to whatever extent we like.
So how do we build up Congress? How can the quote-unquote world's greatest deliberative body increase its capacity and resume its rightful place at the head of our democratic process? Well, the good news is that the Constitution gives Congress essentially a blank check to arm itself with whatever resources it deems necessary to do its job. Congress has leveraged this power in the past to create a number of so-called legislative support agencies. These groups are staffed with nonpartisan experts who can be the brains of Congress, supplying it with unbiased information on various issues. Some of these, like the Congressional Budget Office, which provides cost estimates of proposed legislation, do their job well and are relied upon by members on both sides of the aisle. Looking to the CBO as a model, experts in the field have proposed a Congressional Regulation Office that could serve as both watchdog and policy shop, alerting members of Congress to administrative actions that go beyond the scope of the law, and helping them craft legislation with enough detail and specificity to prevent such abuses in the first place. Having such a trusted in-house voice would also help Congress tune out the various lobbyists and activist groups on both sides, which some scholars argue could even increase bipartisanship.
Members of Congress have a lot of disagreements with each other, of course. They represent different places, different interests. Disagreement is bound to happen. But we would like to see them disagree about what we ought to do given the state of the world, rather than just having completely divergent pictures of what the world is like today. And so having some kind of neutral institutions that try to say, well, what is the state of play at the moment? Where are we going to start off from is really important. Obviously, a Congressional Regulation Office wouldn't get all the Republicans and Democrats to think the same things about what we ought to do on regulation. Those will remain issues of intense partisan controversy. What they might do is help members coming from both sides understand the situation today, understand what current laws are doing and where they're failing, and therefore give them a shared sense of what the problems are that they need to be confronting and figuring out how to compromise on together.
Put in these terms, it's hard to imagine such a proposal being controversial. But that's not accounting for the level of disdain that people have for Congress. Current members of Congress are afraid that if they stick their necks out for their own institution, critics will portray them as self-important and out of touch. But these scholars say critics of such a proposal both overestimate the cost and underestimate the potential savings.
Should we spend $30 million on some agency that's going to help Congress work much better? $30 million, that's so much money. That's how it sounds to a lot of people. But really, $30 million would be a pittance in the overall federal budget. The stakes of these regulatory decisions are enormous, going into hundreds of billions of dollars. So for Congress to say it can't afford an investment of $20 or $30 million in itself to make sure that it can play a constructive role in the policymaking process, that's really penny wise but pound foolish. To look after the American people's interests, it needs to be smart. And just saying, oh, well, it would be too expensive to be smart really seems short-sighted.
In a larger sense, however, the economics are besides the point. The lifeblood of democracy is trust, and as we know, our supply of it is running dangerously low. Building out Congress's brain so that it can more smartly oversee regulatory law would not magically solve that problem, but it would help recenter Congress as the proper venue for working through hard trade-offs, and as the most representative branch of government, the place in our politics where we can see ourselves reflected most clearly. Any measure to improve Congress is ultimately a measure to strengthen our democracy.
Listen, in a republic of 330 million people, we don't all get to set the policies ourselves. We have to put our faith in the legislative process as the best way to give voice to our concerns. And we want to have legislators whom we trust, whom we think are really able people operating with the best resources available, who are going to approach these policies problems, work through them in a way that we find admirable and resonant with our own values. An awful lot of Americans have gotten used to Congress being a mediocre institution that acts as a peanut gallery instead of a policymaker. And unfortunately, that means they don't push Congress to be what it needs to be, which is their voice in American government. If they want American government to reflect their values, they need to push Congress to fix itself and to put itself in the driver's seat for American policymaking.